What's not to love about beat-em-ups? It's pure mindless fun. These types of games rose to prominence during the late 80s in arcades with games like Double Dragon. Beat-em-ups really took off in the early 90s with tons of clones and imitators. Streets of Rage, X-Men, The Simpsons, and Final Fight. Now, a lot of people, myself included, didn't know for years that Final Fight actually started out as a Street Fighter game. Yeah. Capcom was developing a sequel to the first Fighting Street title. This new game was going to be in the beat-em-up style instead of one-on-one. Then somebody at Capcom said, nah, fuck that. The sequel is going to be one-on-one too. So, since they already had so much work done on Fighting Street 2, they continued work on that game and renamed it to Final Fight. With that other game now also renamed Street Fighter 2. Well, you all know how that story turned out. The original Final Fight was released by Capcom into arcades in 1989, and I remember it being one of the first beat-em-ups I played in the arcade. The premise is simple enough. This chick, Jessica, gets kidnapped by a ruthless street gang called Mad Gear. So said bitch's boyfriend Cody sets off to rescue her. Turns out the mayor of Metro City, Mike Hager, is Jessica's father. So this idiot basically leaves his official duties and instead runs around the city, shirtless, body slamming people. Now, if that doesn't scream late 80s awesome, I don't know what does. So there's both of the playable characters. You have the faster, more agile one in Cody, and the slower, heavy-handed, heavy-footed schmuck. Oh, and there's also Guy, your all-around martial artist. You pick your character and set off. There's 6 zones that comprise Metro City. At the end of each, you face a boss character. The controls basically follow the same shtick as Double Dragon. You have a punch button and a jump button. By pressing both at the same time, it usually does an area attack, while hitting both buttons and moving the joystick in a direction results in a jumping attack. There's the ability to throw people as well. Besides your fists, there's also a wide selection of weapons at your disposal too. Bats, pipes, knives, swords, clubs, and all sorts of things. These are usually found either by enemy drops or by breaking environmental items like barrels and crates. They can also contain life items, keeping your ass alive. You make your way through each zone, kicking the shit out of everybody in your way. This colorful cast of characters have such 80s names like 2P, Hugo, Rolento, and Andore. Speaking of bosses, they're pretty simple. There really isn't much to them. You make it to the end, destroy the leader of Mad Gear, and rescue your bitch. Or your daughter, I guess, if you're playing as Hager. Now, as most of us know that grew up during the early 90s, the Final Fight series really grew to prominence and widespread attention when the SNES port of the game came out. In fact, the next 2 games in this trilogy review, Final Fight 2 and Final Fight 3, were released on the SNES only. The SNES ports are pretty good translations, or I should say, the first game is, since the other 2 never got arcade releases. However, they did have to change certain things because of the limitations on the SNES over the CPS arcade hardware. The amount of on-screen enemies are cut by 3/4, as the arcade version could handle as many as 10 enemies on screen at once. Certain characters were changed to better suit not only the home version, but the North American market. Overall, Final Fight is an easy classic, in either version you play. Most people would have played the SNES version, but the original version is still playable easily in MAME these days. Released in 1993, Final Fight 2 continues the fun beat-em-up style of the first game, but adds new things as well. It was only made for the SNES and never saw an arcade release. The storyline in this game is pretty simplistic. Basically, in this game, Mad Gear from the first game has returned and has moved overseas to Japan. As payback for what happened in the first game, they kidnap Maki's sister Rena and her father. Maki gets a hold of Hager and asks him to come help. Hager has nothing else going on. You know, like the daily running of Metro City or anything like that. So sure, why not? He gets a hold of Carlos and the two head off to Eurasia to help Maki out. Unlike the first game, there are 3 playable characters in the second game: Carlos, Maki, and Hager. I think basically Maki takes Cody's place, and Carlos fills in for Guy. You'll notice right off the bat that Carlos has a sword on his back, and for some stupid fucking reason, the only time he uses it is to do your special attack, instead of just whipping it out and cutting people's heads off. Like, what's the point of having a sword if you're still punching and kicking people? Anyways, there are 6 stages in total, with you traveling through Asia into Europe. Once again, like the first game, there are 6 bosses, one at the end of each stage. At the end of the game, you face off against the Mad Gear's leader, kick the shit out of him, and everything is well. There aren't that many differences between this game and the first game in retrospect. It's pretty much the same formula, but the sprites have been polished up a little, and the attacks are animated slightly different, but that's mainly it. One thing that the sequel does fall a little short on is the audio side of things. The sound effects are pretty much in line with what's to be expected on the Super Nintendo, but the music kind of falls short in my book. Not only is there a lack of total musical content, but the same tracks keep getting repeated in almost every stage, which does tend to get a little annoying about after the first 2 or 3 stages. The characters are animated well, or goddamn, it looks like Hager really roided out for the sequel. I mean, I know he was a big guy in the first game, but holy shit. We finally come to the end of this trilogy. Final Fight 3 was released in 1995 on the Super Nintendo, and is the final game rounding out the series. It does improve upon the second game overall by this time in the chronology of video games, basically because we were moving towards the N64 and the original PlayStation, so not a lot of attention was given to the third game in the series. Hager returns as usual, and Guy from the first game returns as well. They are joined by 2 newcomers, Lucha and Dean. So you have 4 characters to choose from, but overall pretty much Lucha and Dean all function the same way, just with different attacks and whatnot, but strength-wise pretty much the same. So in part 3 of the series, basically sees the Mad Gear gang destroyed at the end of the second game, and all the gangs in Metro City are sort of vying for control, and the Skull Cross gang comes out on top, and they're basically trying to take control of the city. So the mayor and Guy take off to fight them alone, as apparently Metro City has no police force whatsoever, or no military, or anything other than the mayor to stop crime whatsoever. It's the same shtick as the other 2 games. You fight your way through each stage, and at the end you face off against the giant roided out Hulk. You make your way towards the final boss, who in this game is known as Marshall Black. Basically, when the Skull Cross gang decided to break him out of prison is what set the whole game in motion. Let me start off by saying that unlike the previous 2 games, the speed of the gameplay has been increased significantly. So it's not so much a plodding, meandering type of beat-em-up anymore. Especially when the playable characters move a lot faster, and their attacks come much faster as well. The amount of attacks you can do has also been increased, with multiple throw options, and even do some special moves, like apparently Guy went and studied under the same ninja master that Ryu can in Street Fighter, because now he can throw Hadoukens. The usual gang of idiots return as well, as far as enemies go. And they all have stupid, corny names like Stan and Ralph and Fuckface. At least Andore is here. Because, you know, it wouldn't be a Final Fight game if we didn't have fucking Andore. One of the other cool things about the third game is that you can actually play 2-player without having a second person play the game. because you can set the second character on autoplay, which is a lot of fun, even though these types of games are kind of made more fun if you're playing with a friend than by yourself, because playing by yourself, they do tend to get a little boring. One of the stupid things that I dislike, much like one of the 2-player options in Double Dragon, is that if you set the second player to autoplay, you can still hurt each other, which doesn't really make any fucking sense, because why would you have a second player on screen that's helping you attack everybody when you can basically kill each other? Get to the end, kill Marshall Black, and that's the end of the game. Sweet and simple. There isn't much else to this game, or for the series for that matter. Final Fight and its sequels, I think, occupied a particular niche in the timeline of video games, because after the mid-90s, if not the late 90s, the beat-em-up style really sort of faded out entirely. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't think that there's been a very popular beat-em-up style game released probably in the last decade, if not longer. It's just a style of gameplay that went really well back when the Super Nintendo was on the market, and more around the time of the 8-bit and 16-bit game systems. But with newer systems coming out, such as the PlayStation, PlayStation 2, Xbox, etc., there was a move away from this sort of simple pick-up-and-play games to more sort of a lot more complicated and in-depth involved video games. I mean, don't get me wrong, these games are still fun to play to this day, and they were a lot of fun growing up as a kid, but it's a good example of a style of gameplay that was popular for a time, and then it sort of went away, as opposed to, say, like a platforming game or an RPG, which are genres that have never really faded out over time, as those styles of games are still being made today. All three of these games are still playable today, either on the Virtual Console on the Wii, or you can play them through emulation as well. While the second and third games are great on their own, I still would probably recommend playing the arcade version of the original before I suggest you play the second and third games for the Super Nintendo. The arcade version is just a lot better presented. It's a lot better combat, etc., etc. The original game was one of the greats back in the 90s, and the second and third games were pretty good on their own as well. Overall, it's a classic trilogy on the Super Nintendo. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, go check it out. Don't forget to check out my Twitch account for live shoot-'em-up action, my real-time playthrough videos, MAME Mondays, and other fun gaming videos as well. Now, as most of us know that grew up in the... Now, as most of us know that grew up during the Now, as most of us know that grew up in... Now, as most of us know during... Now, as most of us know that grew up in during the early 90s, the Final Fight series really grew to prominence and widespread attention when the SNES port came... Fuck!